The Sapphire Lounge sat on the 42nd floor, a steel tower piercing the New York skyline like a needle of glass and ambition. Inside, the city below was just scattered lights, distant problems for distant people. Julian Westfield sat at table 7 by the window, his fingers wrapped around a whiskey he hadn't tasted in 20 minutes. His phone, after an hour of relentless buzzing from investors and PR specialists, lay silent, face down on the white tablecloth. They all wanted the same impossible thing from him. Proof of stability. They wanted him to walk into tomorrow's charity gala with someone on his arm, someone who could smile for the cameras and convince the financial world that Julian Westfield was not the unstable genius the tabloids claimed. Someone who could make $38 billion in quantum computing assets seemed safe in the hands of a man who lived alone and talked more to algorithms than to people. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of people who never worried about money, only how to display it. Julian watched them without seeing, his mind running calculations that had nothing to do with code or markets. He was trying to solve an equation with no variables he controlled. Every woman in his social circle had already declined his invitation, some politely, some with barely concealed amusement. The truth was simple and brutal. He had built an empire, but he had not built a life. Nora Bennett appeared at his table with the grace of someone who had learned to become invisible while standing in plain sight. She carried a tray, placing his second whiskey down with practiced precision. Her uniform was crisp, black and white, standard issue for the lounge, but something in the way she moved suggested a mind always 3 steps ahead of her body. Julian looked up, and their eyes met. Hers were gray, the color of a winter sky before snow. In that brief connection, he saw something he recognized from his own mirror each morning, intelligence being suffocated by circumstance. Dreams being crushed under the weight of survival. She turned to leave, but he spoke before he could stop himself. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "How much do you make in a night working here?" The question hung in the air, both an insult and an invitation. Nora's shoulders tensed. She turned back, her expression a careful, neutral mask. "That's not your concern," she said, her voice polite but edged with steel. But Julian was desperate, and desperation makes people reckless. "I'm not trying to offend you," he said. "I genuinely want to know." She studied his face, searching for mockery or cruelty. Finding neither, she gave him a number. $300 on a good night, sometimes less. The honesty in her voice made the amount sound even smaller. Julian felt something twist in his chest. That number was her survival, her effort, her time. To him, it was less than he'd spend on a single bottle of wine he'd never finish. He leaned back in his chair and made a decision that would unravel both their lives. "I'll pay you $12,000 for one evening," he said. "Tomorrow night, a charity gala. You'll sit beside me, speak when spoken to, and help me appear like a man who hasn't completely isolated himself." Nora's face went very still. For several seconds she didn't breathe, didn't blink, just stood there processing an offer that sounded like either salvation or a trap. Julian watched pride war with need on her features. He saw her dignity fight against the crushing weight of unpaid medical bills. An apartment she could barely afford, and a younger brother whose leukemia treatments were draining every dollar she could scrape together. She opened her mouth to refuse. The words were right there, ready to defend her self-respect. But then she thought of Christopher in that hospital bed, of the payment plan she was already 3 months behind on, of the MIT acceptance letter she had framed and hidden in her closet because looking at it hurt too much. She'd have been 2 semesters away from a degree in computer science when her mother died, and her father disappeared into grief and gambling debts. Julian saw the exact moment she made her decision. Something in her eyes shifted from resistance to reluctant acceptance. "I'll do it," she said, "but I have conditions. I will not pretend to be your girlfriend. I won't lie about who I am if anyone asks directly. And I will be treated with respect, not as property you've rented for the evening." Her voice shook slightly on the last condition, betraying the fear beneath her brave words. "Agreed," he said immediately. "His terms are acceptable. Admirable." He respected someone who negotiated from weakness without surrendering their dignity. He pulled out his phone. "Your banking information. I'll send half tonight as a deposit. The rest after the event." His matter-of-fact tone made it sound like a business transaction. But something in the air suggested it was already more complicated. Nora provided her details with hands that trembled just enough for him to notice. When she walked away from his table this time, she moved differently, as if the weight she carried had shifted into a new, unfamiliar configuration. She finished her shift in a daze, her mind spinning through 1,000 scenarios of how tomorrow night might unfold. Julian left the restaurant an hour later, stood on the sidewalk looking up at the indifferent stars barely visible through the city glow. He had solved his immediate problem with money, the way he solved most problems. But as he climbed into his car, he felt he'd just set something in motion he could not predict or control. That night, Nora sat in her tiny apartment in Queens, staring at her phone as $6,000 appeared in her account like a hallucination. She transferred $4,000 immediately to the hospital, watched her brother's outstanding balance drop, and felt tears she'd held back for months finally break free. She cried not from happiness, but from the complicated shame of being saved by a stranger's money, of being so desperate that pride became a luxury she could not afford. Across the city, Julian stood at his penthouse window, looking out at the glittering metropolis he had conquered financially, but never actually touched. He thought about gray eyes and quiet strength, about a woman serving whiskey, 2 billionaires, while carrying burdens that would have crushed weaker people. And for the first time in years, he felt something beyond the cold satisfaction of a successful deal. He felt curious. He felt uncertain, felt almost human. Neither of them slept well that night. They lay in their separate worlds, connected by $12,000, and a bargain that promised to be simple, but already felt like the beginning of something that would change everything. Thanks for watching. You enjoyed this story? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The afternoon sun filtered through Nora's small apartment window, casting long shadows across the single dress hanging on her closet door. She'd owned it for 3 years, a find from a consignment shop for a wedding she attended, when life still held promise. The deep emerald fabric had seemed elegant then, but now every worn seam and faded thread told the story of her declining circumstances. She showered until the hot water ran cold, scrubbing away the smell of grease and coffee that clung to her skin like a second uniform. Her hands shook as she applied makeup, using techniques she learned from tutorials watched on her cracked phone screen during lunch breaks. Foundation to hide the exhaustion, eyeliner to create confidence, lipstick the color of wine to convince the world she belonged in rooms she had only ever cleaned. When she finally slipped into the dress, she barely recognized the woman staring back from the small mirror. The fabric hugged her frame in ways that made her feel exposed and powerful at the same time. She twisted her dark hair into an elegant knot, securing it with pins that had belonged to her mother. Each small preparation felt like armor being assembled for a battle she was not trained to fight. Her phone buzzed at exactly 6 o'clock. The message from Julian was brief and professional. He would arrive in 15 minutes. She should be ready. The formality of his words was a stark reminder. This was not a date, not a fairy tale, just a transaction between two people using each other to survive their different kinds of desperation. When the black car pulled up, Nora felt her stomach tighten. She grabbed her small clutch, the one nice accessory she owned, and walked down the 4 flights of stairs with her head held high. Julian stood beside the car door, and when he saw her, something flickered across his face too quickly for her to name. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He looked different outside the restaurant. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his dark hair swept back with casual precision. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep, brown, and guarded. The eyes of someone who had learned early that showing emotion was a weakness. He opened the door for her without a word, and she slid into the leather interior that smelled of expensive cologne and new money. The drive through Manhattan unfolded in tense silence. Finally, Julian turned to her and laid out his expectations. She should stay close to him. She should smile but not speak unless directly addressed. Instruction felt like a small erasure of her identity, but she had agreed to this. She nodded once, storing the rules away. Doormen in pristine uniforms opened glass doors that probably cost more than her yearly rent. Inside, the lobby stretched upward into vaulted ceilings, painted with gods and mortals, as if to make guests forget they were merely human. Julian's hand found the small of her back, guiding her toward the ballroom. His touch was light, impersonal, but Nora felt it like electricity. The ballroom took her breath away. Hundreds of people in designer gowns and tailored suits clustered in groups, their laughter echoing off walls hung with priceless art. Waiters glided between them with champagne and delicacies Nora couldn't name. A string quartet played from a raised platform. Everything gleamed with the particular shine that only unlimited money could produce. Eyes turned toward them as they entered. Nora felt the weight of assessment, the room measuring her worth in seconds. Designer dress or consignment? Real jewelry or fake? Confidence or pretense? She lifted her chin, meeting their gazes with the same calm she used for difficult customers. She would not shrink. She would not apologize for occupying space she was paid to fill. Julian introduced her to a succession of people whose names blurred together. Hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs, philanthropists. Nora smiled and nodded, playing her part. But then Victor Reeves appeared. Shorter than Julian, older, with silver hair and a smile that never reached his calculating eyes. Nora recognized him from news articles. He ran a rival quantum computing firm and had been trying to poach Julian's top engineers for a year. Victor's gaze slid over Nora with barely concealed contempt. He addressed Julian, but kept his eyes on her, wondering aloud where Julian had found such a lovely companion. His tone suggested he knew exactly where and for how much. The insult hung in the air like poison. Nora felt Julian tense beside her, preparing to deflect, but something snapped inside her. She turned to Victor with a smile that was all teeth and spoke before Julian could stop her. She said it was interesting to meet him. She'd read about his company's recent struggles with quantum decoherence in their processor design. Such a shame they were still using outdated topological approaches when the industry had clearly moved toward error correction through surface codes. Perhaps, if they invested more in research instead of corporate espionage, they might achieve results worth celebrating. The small circle went silent. Victor's face flushed red. Julian stared at Nora, his mouth slightly open. She had just demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible for a random dinner companion, speaking the language of quantum computing with fluency. Victor sputtered something about not knowing Julian's date was so well-informed. Nora corrected him gently. She was not his date, merely an acquaintance. And yes, she found quantum mechanics fascinating. She had studied it at MIT before circumstances required her to leave. The admission cost her pride, but she delivered it without shame. Victor retreated, his dignity shredded. Suddenly, the guests surrounding them were asking Nora questions about her background, her thoughts on emerging technologies, her perspective on ethical AI. She answered each inquiry with intelligence and grace, no longer playing a role, but simply being herself. Julian stood beside her in stunned silence. He watched her command the conversation, watched Harvard graduates and Stanford PhDs lean in to hear her opinions. He watched her transform from a hired prop into the most interesting person in the room. Something shifted in his chest, a recognition that terrified him, because it felt dangerously close to admiration. To the beginning of something real. When they finally escaped to the balcony for air, the city spread below them like a carpet of light. Nora gripped the railing and let out a long breath. She apologized for speaking out of turn, for violating his rules. Julian moved to stand beside her. He told her she had nothing to apologize for. She had been magnificent. He asked why she'd never mentioned her MIT background, her knowledge of his field. Nora laughed, a sound without humor. She explained that waitresses with physics knowledge were still just waitresses to most people. Intelligence didn't pay bills or save dying brothers. The first time all evening they looked at each other without pretense. He saw not a transaction, but a woman who had sacrificed everything for family. She saw not a billionaire, but a lonely man who had built walls so high he had trapped himself inside. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither could say. He told her she deserved better than serving people who couldn't see her worth. She told him he deserved better than paying strangers to pretend he wasn't alone. The honesty felt dangerous and necessary. When they returned to the ballroom, something had changed. Julian no longer guided her with detached formality. She no longer smiled with practiced emptiness. They moved through the rest of the evening as partners, and when the night finally ended, neither wanted to say goodbye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you next time. The days following the gala passed like scenes from someone else's life. Nora returned to her shifts at the Sapphire Lounge, carrying trays and refilling water glasses as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The remaining $6,000 sat in her account like a question she couldn't answer. Yes, but it felt heavier than any money she'd made through honest labor. Julian sent a single text 2 days after the event. It was formal, distant, thanking her for her discretion and professionalism, exactly what their arrangement had called for. On the balcony when his carefully constructed walls cracked just enough to reveal the loneliness underneath. 3 weeks passed. Nora convinced herself she'd imagined any real connection. Rich men didn't seek out waitresses after using them for a PR stunt. She had served a function, been compensated, and the story ended there. She visited her brother Christopher in the hospital, watching him sleep peacefully now that his treatments were back on schedule, and told herself the shame was worth this small mercy. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, Julian walked into the Sapphire Lounge. The restaurant was nearly empty. Nora was refilling salt shakers at the bar when she sensed someone watching her. She turned, and there he stood, looking oddly out of place in jeans and a simple black sweater. Without the armor of his expensive suit, he seemed younger, more uncertain. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. He asked if she had a few minutes to talk. His voice was different, carrying none of the commanding tone she remembered from the gala. She glanced at her manager, who nodded. His curiosity piqued. They sat at the same corner table where this had all begun. Julian ordered a coffee he never touched. Nora folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable but necessary. Finally, he spoke. He told her he couldn't stop thinking about that evening. Not the successful networking, but the moment she had revealed her true self. He confessed he'd spent 3 weeks trying to forget her, trying to return to the comfortable numbness of his isolated existence. But he kept remembering her voice when she talked about quantum mechanics, the fire in her eyes when she refused to be diminished, the quiet strength that no amount of money could ever buy. Nora felt her throat tighten. She told him he was confused. What he remembered was a performance, a version of herself she had assembled for his benefit. The real Nora Bennett was sitting across from him now, wearing a stained uniform and smelling of industrial kitchen soap. This was who she really was. Julian leaned forward, his expression intense. He disagreed. The woman at the gala, he said, had been real. Perhaps the most real person in that entire ballroom. He wanted to know more about her, not as an employee or a transaction, but as a person whose mind he found endlessly fascinating. The vulnerability in his admission broke something open in Nora's chest. She started talking and couldn't stop. She told him about her mother's cancer, the medical bills that consumed their savings, her father's descent into gambling, the full scholarship to MIT that had felt like an escape until it became just another loss, Christopher's diagnosis, and the impossible choice she had to make between her education and her brother's life. She described nights spent studying quantum physics textbooks stolen from university libraries, working out equations on napkins during slow shifts, just keeping her mind alive while her dreams died piece by piece. She confessed the shame of having a brilliant mind that had nowhere to go, of watching former classmates publish research papers while she calculated tips and avoided landlords. Julian listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finally fell silent, drained from the honesty, he reached across the table. His hand hovered near hers, asking for permission. She gave it by closing the distance, their fingers intertwining with careful intention. He told her he understood more than she might think. His wealth had built different kinds of prisons. He had money, but no purpose beyond accumulation. Success, but no meaning. A penthouse full of expensive emptiness. He'd forgotten how to connect with people as anything other than assets or obstacles, till that night, when she had reminded him what it felt like to truly see someone and to be seen in return. Nora wanted to pull away, to protect herself from a hope that felt too fragile to trust, but something in his eyes held her still. This wasn't charity. This was recognition, between two people who understood what it meant to be brilliant and broken in different ways. Then Julian made a proposal that had nothing to do with money. He told her his company was developing educational AI platforms. They needed someone who understood both advanced theory and practical application, someone who could translate complex concepts for diverse audiences. He wanted to offer her a position. Not out of guilt or pity, but because after 3 weeks of reviewing candidates, he realized the perfect person had been in front of him all along. Nora's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to be his project, his redemption story. But Julian anticipated her objection. He showed her the job description on his phone, the salary range, the detailed requirements. What would happen if she failed, if her years away from formal study had left her too far behind? Julian smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. He told her failure was just data. They would learn together. Tears gathered in her eyes. She asked why he was really doing this. Julian's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. Because watching her potential go to waste felt like a crime he could actually prevent. Because he wanted to see what would happen when someone with her mind finally got the chance she deserved. Because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, she had become important to him in ways that terrified and exhilarated him equally. She accepted his hand across the table, a gesture that meant more than any contract. They began meeting regularly after that. Coffee conversations stretched into hours. Walked through the city where they debated everything from quantum entanglement to the ethics of wealth. Slowly, carefully, they built something neither had experienced before. A partnership based not on transaction, but on genuine respect and growing affection. Julian started questioning the empire he had built, redirecting resources toward scholarships and educational initiatives. Nora returned to her studies with fierce determination, her mind awakening like a muscle to long dormant. Christopher's health improved. Their relationship deepened into something they both recognized as transformative. 6 months after that first desperate offer, they stood together at the launch of the Westfield Foundation, a scholarship program for students who had abandoned their education due to financial hardship. Nora was its director. Julian had learned that wealth meant nothing without purpose. As cameras flashed, Julian looked at Nora and saw not the woman he had hired, but the person who had saved him from a life of isolated success. Nora looked back, understanding that sometimes the most unlikely transactions can become the foundation for the most genuine transformations. They had both been desperate that night in the Sapphire Lounge, trapped by different kinds of poverty. But in finding each other, they had discovered that true wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts, and everything to do with being seen, being valued, and choosing to build something meaningful. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more.